The urgency of the climate change threat is particularly well understood by those of us living in the Caribbean, where we're constantly reminded of its potential to disrupt our economies and destroy our lives. Because of this, there are several attempts being made throughout our region to lessen the impact of climate change and to adapt to the harsher conditions it's already creating in the small island developing states we call home. Of course, these efforts come at a high monetary cost, and finding the funds needed to start and stay moving isn't the most straightforward process. That's why we'll be using the next few episodes of the Caesar Voices podcast to take a closer look at how projects and programs aimed at sustainability are funded. In this episode, we'll be looking at the different ways academic institutions such as the University of the West Indies work towards fueling Caribbean innovation, with guidance from Dr. Graham King, Director of the St. Augustine Center for Innovation and Entrepreneurship.
We really depend on these international donors to trickle down money into our universities, trickle down money into different types of projects to help the development of the region. But we in the region ourselves, we're not investing properly.
So let's talk a bit about how our leading universities function within the realm of climate finance in this episode of Caesar Voices. The University of the West Indies can easily be seen as a major muscle in the research and development arm of the Caribbean, having contributed greatly to regional growth across a variety of sectors since its establishment in 1948. A lot of the university's work in this regard is handled by purpose-built departments and organizations, such as the St. Augustine Center for Innovation and Entrepreneurship, or STACY for short.
So STACY is a center of the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus. And basically STACY is the hub for innovation and sort of like the technology transfer office for the campus as one aspect of what STACY does anyway. So where there are, is research done on campus that has some commercial potential, it would come through STACY through an invention disclosure process where on behalf of the university, a committee that STACY sort of chairs would assess the potential value of this innovation to the university and decide what interest the university might have in it. And depending on the interest, we might decide to invest in protecting it through patenting or help to commercialize it through establishing licensing agreements, or even creating spin-outs and putting the technology into a spin-out with the founders also, of course, having a significant stake in that to grow the technology to a point where it could actually maybe be transferred to a larger entity to develop it, or maybe in the best case, it's not happened yet for us, but in the best case, the company might grow and become a significant entity in its own right, doing something. So that's the vision really on the innovation, entrepreneurship side, technology transfer.
This alone could go a long way towards transforming not just Trinidad and Tobago, but the entire region. And yet it's just scratching the surface of STACY's activities.
We also started out life as the business development office, which means that we're responsible for finding research funds and helping the campus community, the members of staff and the students to access those funds through responding with proposals to calls for projects. So we support the campus community by providing training in writing proposals, helping them write their proposals, and then in some cases also managing projects, especially the larger scale projects. We manage them from within STACY, or we provide significant support from STACY for projects that are managed within the faculties. What else? Well, we also would do consultancies. The university is full of experts in a whole array of different domains. And so we can put together great teams of experts that can respond to calls for consultancies or requests for proposals from different entities. So we're quite good on the consultancy side, and STACY would tend to be the coordinating entity for consultancy projects. Not necessarily individuals, small scale, but when you get to a larger scale consultancy project, that kind of thing. And then what else? We would be supporting sort of student innovation, entrepreneurship, and helping to develop a culture of entrepreneurship among the students. And finally, we would be our kind of coordinating center for university industry collaboration.
The voice you've just heard there belongs to Stacey's director, Dr. Graham King. He's an automotive engineer with a background perfectly suited to his current role.
I was never really planning to go into academia, to be honest. I had my mind set on industry. And I had kind of plan worked out when I graduated, get my master's, get an MBA, progress in the corporate world in the automotive sector. But I had a kind of whole master's program with funding lined up, and it kind of fell through no fault of my own. That it had been receiving consistent funding for years and years. Then all of a sudden the funding was scrapped, and so okay, right. So I said, okay, maybe I could do a PhD. So I went and talked to a few people about different PhDs they could offer in some very nice universities. But I landed on Warwick University, and they were offering something called the Engineering Doctorate Program. So it's not a PhD. It's a kind of, the distinction between a PhD and the engineering doctorate is that with a PhD, you have to demonstrate novelty and adding to the body of knowledge. And the engineering doctorate, you have to demonstrate novelty and innovation and the application of knowledge. So basically, it's like you got the world of productive sector on one side and academia on the other. The Eng.D puts you right on the bridge between the two. And your job is basically, build that bridge, transport as much knowledge from what exists in the knowledge domain and bring it into the applied domain in the industrial sector. So I started out there, and part of that program is that you actually work with a company, in doing your research. So I've always straddled this sort of gap between industry and academia, or let's say the productive sector and academia.
Graham's entire career has basically followed this pattern, and you can see where it's contributed to his approach.
I spent a lot of my time working for a university, but doing more like consultancy work to support industry and so on. I also worked in industry itself for quite a few years. And then when I came to the Caribbean and started at UWI, I was kind of shocked by the lack of collaboration with industry and just how little value we get from our relationships with our industry partners. And so I think that's what would have, pushed me even more strongly down looking at the innovation ecosystem. So I started doing research into the regional innovation ecosystem, the local innovation ecosystem in Trinidad and Tobago, and how the university fits into that. So I've been researching this stuff for a long time. So that's what really gave me a lot of interest in Stacey, because I think it's a spot in which it's possible, to really make a difference and to have a strong agenda and push this sort of, or let's say lobby and advocate for this increased level of collaboration across the ecosystem. The part which is involving, dealing with multilaterals and all that kind of thing, that's fairly new to me. But the other aspects of technology transfer, the innovation, that's very much like inherent to my makeup, because I've always straddled that gap between academia and the productive sector. So that part of it is absolutely sort of implicit to my makeup, really, and my background. So that's why I found Stacey to be a very appealing prospect when the opportunity came up.
Entities such as Stacey are deeply embedded in the climate funding landscape, playing various roles in a number of major global funding initiatives, such as the HIT Reset project.
We're what we call executing agency for this. So the money is not coming from us, the money is coming from elsewhere. In this case, it's originating in the European Union, and the European Union has contracted the Organization of African, Caribbean and Pacific States, OACPS, as a beneficiary. They have set up an innovation fund. So the European Union is funding the OACPS Innovation Fund. So the OACPS now has sort of created or funded large-scale projects. Well, I would call this a program, but they call it projects. But a kind of program-level activity in all their regions: Pacific, Africa, Caribbean. So there are two of these sort of large-scale projects in the Caribbean, and one of them is run by us. That's the HIT Reset project. I think there are maybe about 3 in Africa, 1 in the Pacific. So It's about 8 altogether across the world. So the Hit Reset project is worth about 5 million euros altogether. And so the university is administering or executing that project. Typically, the university likes to get money for our research, but this one's a different story where we're actually the ones giving the money for other people's projects. So we are providing the funding. We've issued calls to the region, and we are funding about 9 what we call third-party projects, all focused on the title Hit Reset, which stands for Harnessing Innovative Technologies for Resilient Coastal Communities. And of course, that ties into the whole climate change agenda and the fact that the Caribbean is highly vulnerable to climate change. Our island nations are vulnerable in many ways, and one of the main ways is the impact of storms, weather effects on our coastal communities. And bearing in mind the Caribbean is made up of a lot of islands primarily, and of course we have a high proportion of our population living in close proximity to the coastline. So this really impacts a high percentage of the population of the Caribbean.
The Hit Reset project presents a clear reflection of Stacey's philosophy, placing Caribbean ingenuity front and center in the region's efforts to increase resilience.
We're looking at innovative technologies, which may be bringing in technology that's not previously been deployed in the region, or it might be creating entirely new solutions. Most of the innovative technologies are focused around data, mapping data, looking at using data to monitor pests, using data to monitor transport, data to determine the best way for communities to respond to events. And that's what we really need to be able to do within the Caribbean region to address our unique problems, is to harness, I think, indigenous innovation in responding to those kind of challenges.
Stacey also practices its philosophy at home on the St. Augustine campus, where it works to boost the process at its core.
So we actually have within the university a couple of funds which we offer to our internal campus community. So one of them was originally funded by the Trinidad and Tobago government. That is the RDI, Research Development Impact Fund. And that one allows our researchers on campus to apply for, reasonably substantial sums to support their research in a wide variety of different areas. So it's not very specific, it's not very prescriptive. It allows researchers to make a case for the kind of work that they're doing, and it's assessed on merit. If they win, then they're able to, get the money, do the work, and there's a set of requirements. We have managed that whole fund from within our office, and we ensure that the projects that are awarded meet the requirements in terms of reporting, feedback, measuring the impact of the projects, and so on, because this is RDI, Research Development Impact. Another project, another fund which is available, which is sort of a little more, I would describe it as downstream, is the ITT fund. That's the Innovation Technology Transfer Fund. That's self-funded from within the university. That fund is specifically geared towards projects which have some commercial potential, and we want to allow the projects to do the work that will bring them closer to market. So say from an RDI project, for instance, we are able to establish some technology or some research which has this sort of commercial potential, but it's a proof of concept stage. The ITT fund will take that and allow for a lot more work and development to be done, maybe including things like patenting, maybe including greater lab work, maybe external support and external partnerships to assist these projects in actually bringing this thing closer to the market and hopefully ultimately to the market. That's the intention with the ITT fund. So it really creates different parts of the pipeline. It funds different parts of the pipeline. So in fact, on campus, you really have 3 parts of the pipeline, because you have a very small scale fund called the Research and Publication Fund, which is accessible, say, to postgrad students to apply to. Gives small amounts of money to capitalize the research. Then you have the RDI fund. Then you have the ITT fund.
Stacey's funding pipeline is designed to encourage the development and spread of new technologies and approaches that can help to create a more resilient future for Caribbean residents. But operating the pipeline comes with its own considerations.
For us on campus, one of the key issues is how do we keep these funds financed? Where does the money come from? But I think the concept of those 3 stages in the process or in the value chain or pipeline of innovation is really important. And in the Caribbean generally, we don't have those. There are big gaps in the funding that's available.
Quite a bit of funding actually flows into the Caribbean each year, with the aim of supporting our efforts towards sustainability. But its providers often overlook certain activities that can form a critical part of these efforts.
You might get funding for a research project, say through one of the multilateral organizations. Some of these large-scale global funds, might cascade down to allow us to do some research or some community action. But the part which involves taking an idea and developing it to a point where it is viable for, say, licensing to a company, to the private sector, creating a spin-out, that section is very absent. Of course, the other section that's very absent when we're talking innovation and technology transfer and so on is the part where you would then, having gone through, say, an ITT fund process, you might get to a point where you could create a term sheet for investment where you want venture capital to come in. That venture capital is also absent.
Luckily, UWI has a direct response to this issue.
The university has actually created something called UVL, University Ventures Limited, which is intending to be a player in that space, primarily for, say, spin-out companies that come through the university. But it has a wider brief and a wider mandate as well. But say, a company comes through the ITT fund, or not a company, but a project comes through the ITT fund and say, okay, now we could create a startup that, encapsulates or owns or has the mandate to develop this technology further and bring it to market. That's where UVL will come in. Now, University Ventures Limited is actually a spin-out itself. It sits outside the fence line of the university, and it really operates on a commercial basis. So it's intended to be profit-making, and it's intended to help these startups, which come out of the university ostensibly, to go through the various stages of development through mentoring and through business development assistance and so on. But also it's intending to be a matchmaker to allow these companies to find investment funds, venture capital funds, to support them as they try to scale up from a startup to a scale-up type of activity. So that's how we're trying to create this value or pipeline of funds that will facilitate ideas coming through from research downstream towards a commercial venture. The ultimate intention with University Ventures is actually to have its own fund, but we're not there yet. So at the moment, we're still in the kind of matchmaking phase where we're finding potential investors and linking them to almost like, because the University of the West Indies has a strong reputation. So it's almost like got a quality stamp to this potential idea. And that can make investors a little bit more willing to put their money into something.
UWI's reputation is a key factor in its involvement in some of Trinidad and Tobago's national projects, many of which are executed with the help of funding agencies such as the Latin American Development Bank.
Globally, there are some very large-scale funds which are financing things like adaptation. So there's the Adaptation Fund, which is global and is looking for projects to help countries and communities adapt for climate change. You've got the Global Environment Fund, which I think is funded by the United Nations. You've got these large funds, the European Union, a major funder. You've got entities like USAID. And they would, to a certain extent, fund projects that do activities, but they would also delegate the responsibility of administering these funds, just like EU did through OECPS for Hit Reset. They delegate, and sometimes you get many kind of stages of delegation of funds. So the project you're referring to there is actually one which is executed by CAF, that's the Latin American Development Bank. And this particular project is in conjunction with the government of Trinidad and Tobago, and it's focused on restoring and protecting and dealing with issues in one particular geographical part of Trinidad, which is in the south part of the country. It's actually a river basin called the South Urupuch River Basin. So this is a very large scale project as well. It's $10 million in value. And it is an adaptation fund project because that area in particular is very vulnerable to flooding. And so this project involves a number of different types of activities, including some infrastructure work to improve drainage, but ostensibly is focused on nature-based solutions through working to restore and to protect mangroves, which kind of are around the delta of that South Oropouche River basin. And those mangroves are under threat. Of course, mangroves in particular have quite an important part to play.
UWI's position as a community-based organization contributes greatly to the effectiveness of projects like this one.
We, as a university, are looking at the research aspect, but the funding bodies want sustainability so that after the 10 million US is spent, that something remains and that the project can effectively continue to have an impact into the long term. To do that, you have to get the community involved. You have to get the community members on board. So with this South Oropouche River Basin, a lot of focus is put on engaging the community, engaging experts or knowledge holders in the communities. In fact, even some of the experts we've recruited who will be on staff basically for 4 years on this project, they're from the region, and deliberately we selected people from that particular area of the country.
Caribbean climate projects receive funds along a variety of channels, and each one represents a slightly different approach to things like mangrove restoration.
We're involved in other projects, ones that we would have actually kind of applied to or put proposals forward for. One of them is with the Inter-American Development Bank, and this is another, since I was talking about mangroves, the South Oropouche River Basin, this is another mangroves focused one. Very, very important ecosystems in our region because, of course, mangroves can sequester 10 times more carbon than an equivalent area of tropical forest. So they're very, very effective as carbon sinks. And, again, under threat. But apart from being carbon sinks, mangroves also are protective ecosystems. They're buffer zones. They help to reduce storm surge, reduce the impact of sea level rise, and they can also improve the quality of water which flows out of the river systems and so on, effectively like a filter. So they perform a lot of functions. Biodiversity is very rich in mangrove forests as well, but they are under threat. And this project that we're participating in is actually funded by the UK government this time. So they have something called the Blue Carbon Fund. And that Blue Carbon Fund is being administered or executed by the Inter-American Development Bank, IDB. And IDB has funded about 5 restoration projects in Suriname, 2 in Colombia, in Panama, in Jamaica, and others down the track potentially as well. And each of those, they're doing work, analysis, data gathering, to look at the problem and the reasons why there's some threat to mangroves, and then executing actions to try to restore them and to bring them back. Now, part of that is they want to be able to create a fund or to allow carbon credits to be assigned to mangroves. But in order to assign carbon credits, you really have to have a way of validating the carbon which is stored in the ecosystem. And that has to be, maintained over a prolonged period of time. There's no point in attributing or selling a carbon credit for an ecosystem which is going to be, only going to have a very limited lifespan, because that's a fantasy carbon credit. The carbon is going to be released again.
Now, this is where we get to see the university's technical capabilities on full display.
So our job as a university, we have to monitor or measure, report and verify the carbon captured in those mangrove restoration projects. So we're helping not just to do it as an exercise, but we're also using new technologies. Research that's been done in the university to use ground-based LiDAR that will allow us 3-dimensional mapping of the mangrove, a volumetric analysis of the trees themselves and the amount of biomass which is stored in the trees. And especially with mangroves, a lot of red mangroves in particular have a complex root system. So some of the traditional ways of measuring carbon or assessing carbon captured in a forest or in a specific tree doesn't work so well in mangroves because it's so complex. So this system allows you to capture in detail an individual tree in 3 dimensions, including these complex root systems. And we've worked with Cambridge University to be able to actually do the volumetric analysis to get it down to a very high level of accuracy, kind of stripping off the foliage from the image we get from the ground-based LiDAR, and then creating this volumetric analysis of the woody material. And of course, you then have to sort of take a sample of the wood and do some carbon analysis. So we're using our carbon analyzer in the university to do that part. So between the volume of wood and the amount of carbon you store in that particular wood, and it does change from forest to forest, location to location, the amount of carbon that you'd capture in a particular tree. So it's a very nice sort of scientific project, but also transferring this knowledge and this methodology to all these projects around the region. And it's significant because the university now reaching into the Latin American region as well in doing this project and sharing knowledge, not just within the English-speaking Caribbean, but across the Latin American Caribbean as well.
Once again, we can clearly see how donor funding can help us unlock the benefits of homegrown innovation, especially as it relates to our struggle to escape the harsh impacts of climate change. But as we mentioned earlier, donated funds can present their own restraints.
Money always comes with an agenda. I think that's ubiquitously true.
Right? Yep.
If you're taking people's money, then that's because they want you to do something with it that's in their interest. And some of the interests that are expressed here, are fairly benign. Things like the Adaptation Fund is really designed for the general benefit of society and so on. But it does still provide some limitations because the access to these funds would depend on almost like customizing. Say you're a researcher and you want to be able to access funds. What it means as a researcher is you have to customize your research to what the funds are offering. And that can be a little restricting, a bit limiting. A lot of the funds in our region do focus on things like development, like ecological solutions and so on. So if you are an engineer and you've got an idea for a fairly, then let's say you've done research in a fairly technical solution, you might find it harder to get money for that kind of thing. Like say you've got some, think of a good example, some new battery technology which you developed in the region in your research activity. To get funding for something like that, which is not necessarily perceived by the external bodies as being a response to a core need in the region, it'd be much more difficult to get money for something like that. You have to be more creative. That's why having our internal funds as a university is extremely important. And that's why it's very important that the governments of the Caribbean region put money into R&D, and that the private sector puts money into R&D as well. And frankly speaking, we're doing a diabolical job there.
Now, of course, we all know that Caribbean SIDS have relatively small economies, but that's not quite what we're talking about here.
We're really dependent on these international donors to trickle down money into our universities, trickle down money into different types of projects to help the development of the region. But we in the region ourselves, we're not investing properly. And to give some statistics around that, the most innovative economies in the world would be investing between, say, 2.5% and 5% of their GDP in R&D. 5% would be countries like South Korea, and the top of the tree is Israel. They invest the most. And I think the Prime Minister of Israel declared Israel to be startup nation, right? So they're really focusing on innovation and driving it. And it creates some very exciting new technologies coming out of Israel. They really punch above their weight given the size of the population and so on. The United States is around 2.5% of their GDP. But when you consider that it's the largest economy in the world still at this point, that's a huge amount of money being poured into R&D of different types of, expressing itself in different areas. Now, that's kind of the global standard. Our economies in the region are investing way less than 1% of our GDP. In fact, in Trinidad and Tobago, it's less than 0.1%. And I think that would be the same in other countries around the region as well. In fact, I think Trinidad and Tobago's latest, most up-to-date score is about 0.06% of GDP. So this is not just how much do we put in. We're not a rich economy per se, so we haven't got much money to put into R&D. This is the proportion of the total value in the economy which is fed back into RDI. So even if we only have a relatively lower amount of money, it still should be a decent proportion of our economy, of our total economy value that's put back into this. And that's the issue I have.
It's a much broader issue than one of government spending.
2.5% in the US takes into account government money and private sector money. So private sector is not investing either. And there are many reasons for that. So this points to the fact that we have to really engender a much more innovation-based economy. We're basically we have commodity-based economies right through the Caribbean. Either the commodity is tourism or oil and gas or sugar in some cases as well. You've got a little bit of sugar and so on. But really and I think this is a legacy of the kind of post-colonial reality where we still operate as commodity-based economies, which is what the islands were used for under the colonizers. And we have to kind of really try to break out of that and do that by putting some serious money, putting a lot of investment into this, start to finance R&D and allow the creation of much more activity in the region to create new knowledge and to create new companies and to create interesting solutions that are indigenous. We have the human capacity. And in fact, we've got a huge diaspora of people, many of whom would love to come and live and work in the Caribbean if they were given a great opportunity to do it, some interesting work to do, money behind it and so on. There'd be a huge amount of diaspora would come back to the Caribbean to support that kind of thing. And so that could really help to build the economy, build the strength of the region. And that's my main complaint to all governments and representatives out there listening to this. Let's try to do something about that.
It's complicated. There's no denying that. But Stacey's work has already shown that there are ways to bridge these funding gaps.
A part of that is to tie in the private sector and try to pull the private sector into participating, whether that's through investments in startups, or, I mentioned one of the activities of Stacey is to coordinate a bit better university industry collaboration. And a lot of universities around the world, they get a lot of their funds from industry partners. Again, where there's money, there's an agenda, right? So you have to somewhat maybe compromise the objectives of your research and be willing pragmatically to work in partnership with the private sector to help solve their problems through your research. But there's a huge amount of money that comes into universities around the world from the private sector. And again, in the region, we only have a tiny drop of money from the private sector. I mean, we're very grateful for what we do get.
But the thing is, Graham isn't even really trying to appeal to anyone's sense of duty or anything like that. It's more a matter of shifting perspective.
I think the private sector tends to see funding of universities in the region as part of their CSR, their corporate social responsibility, or their ESG, whatever you want to. And we want them to start to see it as part of their strategic imperatives to establish technology and knowledge that the company needs to be competitive and to grow itself into the future. That's another part of the innovation ecosystem. A lot of attention tends to be put on the kind of creation of new knowledge, converting it to technology, commercializing it through startups and so on. That's almost like a bottom-up growth, which is very, very important. But there's also a huge potential to engender more innovation in companies by them investing more in their own R&D, and they can invest through the universities and in partnership with universities around the region to do that. So we also have to sort of encourage companies in that. So UVL, University Ventures Limited, is really an important part of that. But also I'd say what we do in Stacey in trying to link our partners in industry more effectively is also really a really key part of it.
It's all part of Stacey's vision for the region. Their ultimate goal is to create a genuinely more fertile environment for innovation and ultimately economic development.
We're really trying to build that up and to get companies to put more in on a longer term basis. We want companies sponsoring research centers over a prolonged period of time. We want companies funding to the point where we can actually pay PhD students, maybe not quite at the level of a graduate salary, but something that's not far off a grad salary type of stipend to encourage more of the high quality students to stay in research activities. This means that as universities, we also have to be willing to focus on, applied research that's going to support the needs of the private sector. So all of this is part of the development picture of the region. On one hand, you've got these multilaterals coming in with substantial funds to help solve problems, and we can tap into that financing through various mechanisms that can help with things like nature-based solutions, help with things like improving adaptation, et cetera, et cetera. On the other side, you've got the private sector and encouraging the private sector to become more innovative, to put more money into its R&D activity, and to grow their way into the future, to innovate their way into the future in working collaboration with the universities. So you kind of got the two dimensions, or there's many more dimensions of that, but these are two important dimensions of development, where money can come from for development in the region. And that ties into the research activities. Then I suppose another dimension is the governments, right? The governments putting their money in and targeting specific areas where they think it's very important that we build capacity, capability, expertise, innovation. So when you have that, it's almost like that tie-up between universities, government, industry, and the commercial sector, the private sector. And then you kind of add into that in our region, in particular, multilaterals. It's a very powerful, it's sort of an adaptation really of what's called the triple helix, the interaction between these different entities that allows for strong development and a strong research, development, innovation ecosystem, which is really what we're trying to create.
Trust me, if we can create the kind of ecosystem Graham just described, we're looking at a much brighter future. But in the meanwhile, for those out there who are trying to access funds, like researchers, people involved in projects and so on, do you have any sort of advice or insight for those persons in terms of trying to propose, make a proposal for these funds, for instance?
So my first piece of advice is get a good concept note together. So if you've got a project you're trying to get money for, write out your concept note and try to capture what you're doing, what your objectives are, where you're at. And this isn't something this is not a thesis, right? This is just maybe no more than, say, about 4 pages of description of your project and what you want, what you need, what the timelines would be. Once you have your concept note together, that's something you can really start to work on and hone, and you can actually use it as the basis of proposals when you see calls for different bits and pieces of money that are coming in. In terms of the University of the West Indies, so in our region, of course, UE is kind of one of the dominant in academic institutions. We have a lot of others around the region as well. I know that. And I think most of these universities do have offices similar to Stacey that can help you to track down and find sources of funds. So one of the things we try to do in our counterparts, because we also have kind of counterparts in Mona campus and in Cayfield campus, we also have a lot of work that's done by the headquarters through the Office of Research, where they also sort of scour. So between all of us, we scour and look for calls that come out through websites and through these different entities. So there's a lot of calls that go out where you could actually submit your proposals for different activities, different pieces of research. So work with your officers in your academic institutions as researchers to find these calls, because there's a lot of work to do it by yourself. You might be able to keep your eye on a few of them, and you can subscribe to some services that will to push calls for proposals to you. But the thing is, when that call comes that you think, this one's suitable for what I'm trying to do, You have to be ready with your concept notes to formulate a suitable proposal in the time frames available, right?
And remember, the general theme here is that you really don't have to do any of this on your own.
Build collaborative partnerships. So if you can collaborate both in your campus community, across campus communities, and internationally, that's going to help you a lot, especially with international partners. A lot of those international partners are much better at accessing funds, and they have a wider source of potential funding, funding sources than we do in the region. So you can tap into that. And, what the region offers is a really good test case for research activity that's done elsewhere as well. So, for instance, I'm an automotive engineer, and we're in the middle of this huge transition to e-mobility, electromobility. The problem with electric vehicles is they're very expensive, that's a barrier to adaptation in our region. But they're very, very relevant and very, electric vehicles very effective in our region because we don't have the range anxiety and those sort of things that other countries have. So they could be a really important part of our transition away from fossil fuel dependency. So one of the things that we have in our region is a lot of shared taxis and that kind of thing. Can we get those shared taxis transitioned to electric? They are going to be running all day. How do you deal with the range issues and so on? So one of the things I'm looking at is saying, well, could we look at conversions instead of buying new vehicles, look at converting existing vehicles from diesel to electric? And let's combine that with a kind of battery swapping type of system. So instead of having to wait for charge in the middle of a hectic day as a taxi driver, you could just switch out your battery in 5 minutes and continue. So that's a whole system. So that's something which maybe isn't as relevant, where you've got better charging infrastructure or where you've got different duty cycles in the global north. But in our small island region, that's going to be very relevant, and we want to make it very accessible. So that's an area of research that's quite technical, quite specific and specialized, but there are ways you can find to access that, and then you could establish partnerships with international universities, companies, and so on that would be interested in this as a use case or as a specific context in which some of the work they're doing could be applied. So you get great opportunities for partnership there. And that way you can get money, not necessarily from the region, but from outside the region to help you with your research too. So that's another thing that I'd strongly encourage. Then, of course, things like conferences, use your conferences to make those networks, right? Use your LinkedIn to make those networks and establish partnerships.
At the end of the day, we just need to recognize that we really can help each other in ways that could benefit all of us.
I think it can be a little discouraging sometimes in our region to be a researcher because of these issues of resources, not just financial, but often our labs are somewhat under-resourced, and it's more difficult to access expertise or knowledge and so on. But I think, I just encourage everybody listening to keep up the fight. We have so much capacity and capability in the region, basic expertise, basic high levels of intelligence and capability in our academic sector. So keep up the fight and keep pushing, because we all together, we can actually bring improvements gradually. Let's use our voices as this is a Voices podcast. Let's use our voices to encourage change and to encourage thought, especially among our leaders, so they can be encouraged to put money where it matters and where it can really have a long-term impact through building the innovation ecosystems around the region and putting a lot more stall in innovation and the research, development, and innovation system for building our future as a Caribbean, solving our own problems and creating our own economic strength, not depending on external influences so much, but really doing it ourselves.
Innovation is exactly what Caribbean SIDS need to guide us through our current climate circumstances and drive the development of our region. But for a number of reasons, our limited resources are overwhelmingly directed towards other pursuits, leaving researchers to depend heavily on the assistance of foreign interests, who are often too far removed from our predicament to completely understand our needs. University-based organizations such as Stacy are working to correct this situation by directing foreign aid towards innovative endeavors and bridging funding gaps between industry, government, and academia. And this is because these organizations are run by individuals like Graham, who understand something very important. You see, those of us living in Caribbean states might see our region for the most part as impoverished. But if we can all shift our perspective and focus on the big picture, we might realize that collectively we do have the resources needed to address our problems. And if we can recognize the universal benefits of bringing these resources together to create our own solutions, we might just be okay. Anyway, that's all we have for you on this episode of Caesar Voices. We'd like to thank our guest, Dr. Graham King, for taking the time to share his insights with us. I hope you'll join us for our next episode, where we'll be continuing our exploration of climate finance in the Caribbean by looking at how issues like gender inclusivity are addressed, with Ibrahim Abdullah, a technical officer working with the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund. In the meanwhile, though, we'd like to take the time to thank our funded partners, the Barbados Environment Conservation Trust, or BECT, and the Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency, or CCRE, for making this episode possible. BECT aims to help Barbados reach its national development goals by supporting local initiatives aimed at environmental sustainability, while CCRE promotes renewable energy and energy efficiency investments, markets, and industries in the Caribbean. Of course, we'd also like to thank our listeners for tuning in to the Caesar Voices podcast. If you like what you've been hearing so far, please feel free to give us a rating wherever you're listening. We'd also like to remind you that you can visit our website, caesarjournal.org/donations, to lend your financial support. Or join our monthly donor club on Patreon and gain access to exclusive content, or even be featured in an episode of our podcast. Just click the links in the description. And if you'd like to sponsor an episode of Caesar Voices and feature your company or NGO, please click on our corporate link to learn more.